Portia, and this is my wife Ellen. A simple introduction, spoken softly, with love. But for millions watching, it was a moment that meant so much more. It wasn't just about two women standing hand in hand. It was about the courage to be seen, to be vulnerable, and to love in the open. For years, Portia de Rossi and Ellen DeGeneres were the face of a love story that defied Hollywood expectations. They were graceful, funny, tender. They showed us what it meant to love fearlessly. But now, after all the lights have dimmed, after the cameras stopped rolling, Portia is finally ready to tell her side of the story. A story not just about love, but about pain, identity, and the silent struggles that can live behind even the happiest smiles. Before she was Portia de Rossi, she was Amanda Lee Rogers, a quiet girl from a small town in Australia. Her childhood was marked by tragedy when she lost her father at the age of 9. That kind of grief leaves a shadow, especially when you're too young to understand it. She spent the rest of her childhood trying to find herself in a world that never felt quite safe. By the time she was 15, she changed her name, hoping a new identity would somehow free her from the pain. And maybe for a while, it did. Ellen's story is no less heartbreaking. At just a teenager, she was abused by her stepfather. The betrayal, the fear, the silence, she carried it all alone. And even after she escaped, even after she became a comedy icon and built a career on laughter, that pain never really left her. They came from different corners of the world, but their wounds were strangely similar. And when they found each other, it felt like the universe had finally handed them the peace they had both been searching for. But love, real love, is never just the highlight reel. It's the quiet conversations at midnight, the arguments no one sees, the personal demons that don't go away just because someone's holding your hand. Over time, the cracks began to show, and while the world saw a perfect couple, behind the scenes, they were trying, sometimes struggling, to hold it all together. Today, we take you on a journey through Portia and Ellen's untold story, from childhood pain to Hollywood fame, from secret battles to very public love, and finally, to the silent goodbye that left so many stunned. What happened to one of the most beloved couples in entertainment? And what can we learn about identity, healing, and love when even the strongest connection begins to fade? Let's take a closer look. Before the red carpets and television lights, before the glamorous name and designer gowns, there was just Amanda. A quiet, observant little girl growing up in Grovedale, a modest suburb in Geelong, Victoria, Australia. Her world was simple, unassuming. She had a father she adored, a mother who worked hard, and a life that felt safe, even if it was small. But that sense of safety shattered when Amanda was just 9 years old. Her father, Barry Rogers, passed away suddenly, and everything changed. Losing a parent at any age is devastating. But for a child, it can fracture the foundation of who they are. Psychologists say that children who lose a parent during their formative years often carry a deep sense of instability and longing into adulthood. It's not just the absence, it's the confusion, the unanswered questions, the silence that follows. For Amanda, her father wasn't just her protector, he was her sense of home. Without him, she was left searching for identity, for security, for someone who could explain the why. Her mother, Margaret, stepped in as best she could. A medical receptionist by profession, she became the sole provider for the family. She worked long hours, trying to keep things together, to make life feel normal again. But Portia has spoken candidly about how that period felt like growing up in an emotional fog. It's something many children of single mothers can relate to, the deep appreciation mixed with the quiet ache of emotional absence. There's love, but also loneliness. There's survival, but not always guidance. What's interesting is how many successful women have emerged from similar emotional terrain. Oprah Winfrey, for instance, was raised by her grandmother and later her mother under deeply difficult circumstances. She too lost stability at a young age, and like Amanda, she grew up with a profound sense of being other, different, misunderstood, and constantly searching for a place to belong. The common thread in many of these stories is the drive to reinvent, to become someone new in order to escape the pain of the past. At just 15, Amanda made a decision that would shape her future forever. She legally changed her name. She chose Portia, inspired by the intelligent, graceful heroine in Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, and de Rossi, an elegant Italian surname she selected for no other reason than its beauty and sophistication. But it wasn't just about sounding glamorous, it was about survival. Reinvention. Reclaiming her narrative. Changing her name wasn't just an aesthetic move, it was a psychological rebirth. In the world of trauma recovery, this kind of identity shift is not uncommon. Survivors often reframe their lives by shedding parts of themselves that feel too painful to carry forward. For Amanda, becoming Portia was her way of separating from the little girl who lost her father, who felt invisible, who didn't quite know where she belonged. And so, Portia de Rossi was born, not just a new name, but a new chapter. A young woman who would chase a dream all the way to Hollywood, still carrying a quiet storm inside her heart. A storm she kept hidden behind flawless makeup and polite smiles, hoping no one would notice the cracks in the porcelain. But they were there, and as she stepped into the world of fame, those invisible wounds would soon meet the harsh spotlight of Hollywood, a place where image is everything, and truth can be hard to hold on to. That's the reality so many young people face, especially in industries that prioritize image over authenticity. There's a common mistake people make when they're trying to belong. They think fitting in means changing themselves. They think the cost of acceptance is their truth. But what they don't realize is that wearing a mask for too long doesn't just fool others. It begins to erase who you really are. Portia has since admitted that she was terrified someone would find out she was a lesbian. That one revelation could undo everything: her reputation, her rising fame, her hard-earned roles. So she kept quiet. She shrunk herself to fit in. And slowly, it began to break her. Because when you're living in hiding, even success feels hollow. And when you're constantly acting, on and off the screen, you start to forget what it feels like to just breathe, to just exist, without fear. But in the middle of all that pressure, something unexpected was about to happen. A woman named DeGeneres. Already out, already brave, already a force in the industry, was about to walk into her life. And for the first time, Portia would be seen. Not as a character, not as a Hollywood figure, but as herself. Portia first met Ellen in 2000 at a party in Los Angeles. Ellen was already a household name, one of the few openly gay celebrities in Hollywood at the time, bold, witty, and unapologetically herself. Portia, on the other hand, was still quietly fighting her internal battles. She had built a career by blending in, hiding in plain sight. And yet, in that one brief encounter, something shifted. It wasn't just attraction. It was recognition. A kind of soul-level connection that made the noise of the world briefly disappear. Portia later confessed that she was immediately drawn to Ellen, not just because of who she was, but how she carried herself. Ellen's openness, her peace with her own identity, was both comforting and intimidating. In Ellen, Portia saw the possibility of a life lived without shame. And that terrified her. They didn't become a couple right away. It took years, 4 to be exact, for Portia to gather the courage to take that step. In 2004, both women were finally single. And this time, when they crossed paths, the connection was undeniable. What had once been a quiet spark grew into something much deeper. A relationship that would transform Portia's life in ways she never imagined. Being with Ellen wasn't just about romance. It was about safety. For someone who had spent her whole life hiding, Ellen became a mirror, gently reflecting back the parts of Portia she had been too afraid to show. Psychologists often talk about how trauma survivors build emotional walls, thick, invisible ones meant to keep pain out. But the thing about walls is that they keep love out too. And Ellen, with her patience, her humor, and her lived experience of rejection and resilience, helped Portia slowly lower those defenses. Coming out is rarely a single moment. For many, it's a process. Messy, painful, sometimes terrifying. But Ellen stood beside Portia through all of it. She didn't rush her. She didn't push. She simply loved her, exactly where she was. And in that love, Portia found something she'd been missing her entire life: the freedom to be fully seen. Their relationship became public not long after, and when it did, they instantly became one of the most visible and beloved same-sex couples in America. For the LGBTQ+ community, especially at a time when representation was still scarce, they were a symbol of hope, of what was possible. Not perfect, but real. Tender, committed, joyful. Their wedding in 2008, held in their Beverly Hills home, was a quiet, deeply personal ceremony. But its impact was loud and far-reaching. Just months after California briefly legalized same-sex marriage, their union felt like a declaration, not just of love, but of equality, of progress, of pride. Millions watched, and for many it was the first time they saw a same-sex couple not just accepted, but celebrated on that level. And yet, even as their love blossomed in public, the private work of healing continued. Because real love, true love, isn't just about grand gestures. It's about showing up on the quiet days. It's about holding space for the past while building something new. And Ellen did that for Portia. Again and again. But as the years went on, new pressures began to rise. Ellen's career kept climbing, and the spotlight grew more intense. Portia, always more private, found herself walking in someone else's shadow. The love between them was real. But love, as we'll see next, isn't always enough to silence the weight of fame, identity, and the need for personal space. Behind the glow of fame and the poise of red carpet elegance, Portia de Rossi was silently fighting a battle most people never saw. While the world praised her for her beauty, her slim figure, her camera-ready presence, inside, she was at war with her own body. A war that began long before she ever stepped foot in Hollywood, and one that nearly consumed her. In her powerful memoir, Unbearable Lightness, Portia pulled back the curtain on a truth she had hidden for years. She wrote with raw honesty about her struggles with anorexia and bulimia, how the fear of gaining weight became all-consuming, how she would restrict herself to just 300 calories a day, and how the number on the scale dictated her sense of worth. At the height of her disorder, she weighed only 82 pounds. Yet still, she believed it wasn't enough. This wasn't about vanity, it was about control, about perfection. About a desperate need to feel valuable in an industry that often makes women believe their worth is tied to their appearance. According to the National Eating Disorders Association, OSNeDay, 1 in 3 female actors and models has experienced an eating disorder. And it's not hard to see why. In an environment where cameras magnify every perceived flaw and casting calls silently demand size 0 figures, it becomes all too easy to equate thinness with success. For Portia, the pressure was relentless. Early in her career, agents told her she needed to lose weight to get more roles. Tabloids would comment on her body before they mentioned her performance. Even among friends, compliments came wrapped in toxicity. "You look amazing. Have you lost weight?" Over time, those words became a trap. A voice inside her whispered that being thinner made her more lovable, more valuable, more safe. But it was a lie. A dangerous one. In her book, Portia doesn't shy away from the darkest parts of her journey. Collapsing in pain from starvation, binging in secret, the shame that followed, and the isolation that came with pretending everything was fine. She described it as a kind of emotional numbness, a slow erasure of the self, masked by smiles and surface-level success. But her story doesn't end there. Healing began quietly and gradually. With Ellen's support, she found space to breathe again. Unlike the rest of the world, Ellen never made her feel like she had to be perfect. In their home, Portia could finally eat without fear. She could cry. She could be vulnerable. And perhaps most importantly, she could speak. Therapy followed. So did meditation, mindfulness, and writing. Putting her story into words was painful, but liberating. Unbearable Lightness wasn't just a book, it was a turning point. A declaration that the mask was coming off, and that her pain might actually help someone else feel less alone. And it did. Young women across the world wrote to her, thanking her for being honest about something so many are taught to hide. Her story gave them permission to speak up, to seek help, to stop apologizing for their hunger, for food, for love, for healing. Portia's journey through eating disorders is a reminder that even in the brightest rooms, darkness can exist. That even when someone seems to have it all, they may be quietly falling apart. And that healing is never a straight line, but it is possible, especially when met with compassion instead of judgment. But as Portia healed, another shift was quietly beginning. The life she had worked so hard to build in front of the camera no longer felt like the life she wanted. After years of performing, for audiences, for casting directors, for the world, Portia began to wonder, who am I when no one is watching? In 2018, without much fanfare or dramatic headlines, Portia de Rossi quietly announced that she was stepping away from acting. No scandal, no tabloid rumors. Just a calm, personal decision to let go of the spotlight that had defined much of her adult life. For some, it came as a surprise. She had recently returned for the revival of Arrested Development, one of her most iconic roles, and fans assumed there was more to come. But for Portia, something had shifted. The applause didn't mean what it used to, and the role she once chased no longer felt like her path forward. So why would someone walk away from Hollywood at the height of their career? That question has lingered over many stars who've made similar exits. Actors like Cameron Diaz, who famously left acting to focus on her well-being and personal life. In a culture that equates visibility with value, choosing to disappear feels radical. But sometimes, stepping back isn't about giving up. It's about reclaiming yourself. For Portia, it wasn't a breakdown. It was a breakthrough. She had spent decades performing, not just as characters on screen, but as a version of herself that the world expected to see. She had overcome trauma, battled eating disorders, and come out publicly in an industry that still often struggles with inclusivity. She had nothing left to prove. What she needed now wasn't another role. It was rest, stillness, space to rediscover who she was, outside of scripts and expectations. And this isn't unique to Portia. There's a growing conversation around fame and its hidden cost. Studies have shown that public figures, especially actors and musicians, face significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout than the general population. The pressure to maintain an image, to constantly deliver, to withstand the weight of public scrutiny, it can quietly chip away at a person's mental health. In recent years, more celebrities have started speaking out about this. Selena Gomez, Simone Biles, Jonah Hill, all have shared openly about the toll fame has taken on their mental well-being. And Portia, in her own quiet way, joined that chorus, not with interviews or confessions, but with a choice. She chose to leave. But she didn't disappear. In fact, stepping away from acting allowed her to step more fully into other parts of her life, parts that brought her peace and purpose. Alongside Ellen, Portia began focusing on animal rights activism, supporting organizations like the Gentle Barn and the Ellen DeGeneres Wildlife Fund. She also dove into art and business, co-founding a company that reimagines digital art in innovative ways. These weren't just hobbies. They were expressions of a self no longer limited by fame, a self that didn't need applause to feel worthy. Sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is listen to that quiet voice inside, the one that says, "This life isn't mine anymore." For Portia, leaving Hollywood wasn't an escape. It was a return to peace, to purpose, to herself. But as she found stillness in the background, Ellen's world was growing louder, more chaotic. The woman who once helped Portia find calm was now facing a storm of her own, one that would change both of their lives forever. For nearly 2 decades, Ellen DeGeneres was known as the Queen of Daytime. With her bright energy, signature dance moves, and generous giveaways, the Ellen DeGeneres Show became a household name across America. Her mantra, "Be kind," echoed from television screens into classrooms, offices, and living rooms. But in 2020, everything changed. The woman who had built an empire on kindness suddenly found herself at the center of a storm that no one saw coming. It began quietly, with whispers, a few online stories, anonymous sources. And then, the floodgates opened. Former employees began speaking out, alleging that behind the scenes, The Ellen Show was anything but kind. Toxic workplace culture, intimidation, racism, bullying. Stories surfaced about producers who abused their power, about fear that ran beneath the smiles. While many of the allegations were directed at senior staff, not Ellen personally, the show bore her name, and so did the responsibility. As the media ran with the story, headlines painted a stark contrast between the on-screen Ellen and what employees said they experienced off-camera. In a time where public figures were being held accountable more than ever, the backlash was swift and fierce. The cancel culture machine had been activated, and Ellen became its latest target. It's important to understand what cancel culture is and what it isn't. On one hand, it's a way for marginalized voices to speak truth to power, to call out injustice and demand accountability. But on the other hand, it can escalate quickly, turning complex human failures into public spectacle, and sometimes leaving little room for growth or redemption. Ellen responded with a public apology. On the first episode of her 18th season, she addressed the allegations head-on, taking responsibility and promising change. "I am a work in progress," she said. "I am learning. Behind the scenes, producers were fired, internal investigations were launched, and systems were restructured. But by then, the damage was done. The image had cracked. And the world didn't look at Ellen quite the same. Through it all, Portia stood by her. Publicly, she posted messages of love and support, encouraging fans to back Ellen and to, quote, continue to believe in kindness. But behind closed doors, it couldn't have been easy. Watching the person you love be picked apart in the public eye is a particular kind of helplessness. Portia, who had already spent years living in Ellen's shadow, now found herself in a spotlight she never asked for, carrying not just her partner's pain, but her own quiet heartbreak as well. This is the weight of fame. One moment, you're idolized. The next, you're scrutinized. We build people up until they're untouchable, then act surprised when they turn out to be human. Flawed, hurting, learning. There's a deep societal discomfort in watching someone fall from grace, because it challenges the fantasy we've created around them. But Ellen was never just a persona. She was a woman who had endured real trauma, who had broken barriers, who had made people laugh through their darkest days, and who had, undeniably, also made mistakes. The truth is rarely black and white. But the consequences, especially in the public eye, almost always are. And while Ellen tried to steady the ship, something else was quietly happening. Her bond with Portia was starting to fray, not because of scandal alone, but because of years of pressure, imbalance, and exhaustion that had quietly built up beneath the surface. From the outside, Ellen and Portia's marriage looked like a fairy tale. A successful talk show host and a brilliant actress, living in a stunning California home, supporting causes they cared about, and appearing inseparable at red carpet events. But like many great love stories, the cracks didn't appear suddenly. They were slow, silent, invisible to the world, but deeply felt within the walls they called home. Over the years, a quiet distance began to grow between them. Not out of anger or betrayal, but out of the sheer weight of life. Ellen's schedule was relentless. Daily filming, interviews, charity appearances, brand launches. Even when she was physically present, her mind was often on her show, her image, her responsibilities. Portia, more private and introspective by nature, found herself alone more often than not, even when Ellen was just in the next room. This is something psychologists call emotional disconnection, a feeling of loneliness not caused by absence, but by lack of attunement. You're together, but not really with each other. And in relationships where one partner is significantly more in the public eye, the other can begin to feel like a shadow, seen, but not truly acknowledged. It's not about jealousy, it's about identity, about needing space to grow, to be heard, to matter outside the reflection of someone else's spotlight. Portia had long supported Ellen's rise, often taking a step back from her own career to give their relationship space to breathe. But over time, that sacrifice came at a cost. She struggled to maintain her own sense of purpose, her own passions, while constantly being defined as Ellen's wife. The imbalance, though never intended, slowly wore them down. They tried, they really did. There was therapy, time off from the show, quieter seasons where they retreated from public life, hoping that stillness would help them hear each other again. Ellen even considered walking away from her talk show at one point, telling Portia, "I'm tired." And for a brief moment, it seemed like they might finally have the chance to rebuild what had quietly started to fall apart. But old habits are hard to break. The show was renewed. The cameras rolled again, and life returned to the rhythm that had slowly pulled them apart. Even as they stood united during public appearances, smiling, holding hands, something deeper had shifted. Portia once said, "We tried, but some things are too broken to fix." And those words held more truth than many realized, because sometimes love is not the question, it's the cost. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do for someone you love is to let them go. They didn't fall apart in some dramatic, explosive way. There were no scandalous betrayals, no bitter words, just a quiet unraveling, a realization that love alone couldn't mend everything life had worn down. But even in the parting, there was grace, there was care, there was history, years of laughter, tears, growth, and healing that would never be forgotten. There was no dramatic press conference, no explosive tell-all, no shouting matches aired across tabloids. When Ellen and Portia quietly confirmed the end of their marriage, the news didn't shake the internet with scandal, but it shook hearts. It was the kind of breakup that didn't need volume to make an impact. The silence said enough. For nearly 2 decades, Ellen and Portia had represented something bigger than themselves. They weren't just a celebrity couple. They were one of the most visible and beloved LGBTQ+ partnerships in America. To many, they were proof that same-sex love could be just as enduring, just as domestic, just as sacred as any other. Their marriage wasn't only personal, it was political, symbolic, powerful. So when it ended, it felt like a collective heartbreak. The reaction from fans was mixed, layered with sadness, understanding, and perhaps most of all, surprise. On social media, people expressed disappointment, not out of judgment, but out of hope lost. If they couldn't make it, one user wrote, "What chance do the rest of us have?" Others responded with compassion, thanking them for being a beacon of representation for so long. "They gave us years of love. That matters too," another fan shared. Because the truth is, we often tie our own hopes to the people we admire. When they rise, we feel lifted. When they fall, we feel the drop. And for the LGBTQ+ community, who have fought so hard for recognition, acceptance, and the right to marry, Ellen and Portia's love story was never just about 2 people. It was about all of us. This isn't the first time a high-profile LGBTQ+ couple has faced the weight of public expectation. When Neil Patrick Harris and David Burtka weathered rough patches in their marriage, the world held its breath, rooting for them to stay strong. When Kristen Stewart's relationships went public, then private, then public again, fans followed every step like breadcrumbs of hope. The stakes are often higher for queer couples in the spotlight because, for years, their very right to love was questioned. So when they break up, it's not just personal, it feels symbolic. But maybe we've been asking too much of them. Maybe it's time we let our icons be human too. Because even the most powerful love stories can reach their end, not out of failure, but out of change, out of growth, out of the quiet realization that sometimes love evolves in ways we didn't expect. That's what made Ellen and Portia's goodbye so powerful. It wasn't messy, it was mature, it was respectful. They didn't deny what they had, they honored it. They let it go with the same grace with which they once embraced it. And that brings us to the question so many are still asking. Is love enough? The answer isn't simple. Because love is not a cure-all. It doesn't erase trauma. It doesn't cancel out imbalance. It doesn't always survive the pressure of public life, the exhaustion of reinvention, or the need for individual space to grow. But maybe that's not the tragedy. Maybe it's the truth we need. That even when love ends, it doesn't mean it failed, it simply finished its course. And if it helped 2 people become more of themselves, stronger, freer, more whole, then it was always worth it.